You're listening to Keeping It Real with Janine, your guide to living an authentic, healthy life podcast. I'm Janine Strong, and every 2 weeks I have an inspiring conversation with an ordinary person leading an extraordinary life. And my guest today is Shannon Moroney. She is truly an inspiration for us all. I found her memoir, Through the Glass, to be incredibly moving. It was hard not to be emotional reading it. It's very difficult not to feel emotional and inspired by her story. But she has another book out now, too, that's coming out this week, and she co-authored it with Timea Nagy. It's the story of Timea Nagy. She is an extraordinary survivor of human trafficking and forced sex labor. So Shannon Moroney was a high school teacher and counselor in 2005 when violence tore her life apart. Her husband of only 1 month had been arrested after confessing to the sexual assault and kidnapping of 2 women. Shannon's heartbreaking story is one of grief, violence, judgment, and stigma, along with the story of a journey filled with compassion, forgiveness, and hope. Hi, Shannon. Thank you so much for agreeing to share your story and Timea's story on my podcast.
Thanks for having me, Janine, and what a nice introduction.
Oh, thank you. I try. Now, we just had a lovely conversation, and you said, oh, we weren't recording. I know. I probably... That happens a lot because this is the first time we've talked. So it was nice to get to know each other, and a lot of really good things came out. But so how about starting with your story, if you'd like, and then we can get into Timea's too, about the timeline of how you were treated. And then we can talk about Timea and you're a restorative justice advocate. I mean, you've done so many things since this happened. I mean, it's a stupid analogy, but you really have made lemonade out of lemons.
It's a good analogy, though. I think, yeah, I think it is. I mean, and I think, what else can any of us do? We don't get a choice about how other people treat us or their actions or decisions. We really only have a choice about how we respond.
Absolutely.
And the choice to try to do something that was meaningful or that made sense out of such a senseless situation and senseless violence that my ex-husband committed was something that I just really felt compelled to do. And I hope I've been able to make a difference.
Now I have to ask you, on retrospect, because hindsight's always, wonderful. Were there any signs for you that there was something off about him?
Not at all.
Interesting.
Not at all. Except for the fact that Jason had committed a crime when he was 18 years old. So 15 years prior to when I met him, he committed a second-degree murder at age 18 and had served a 10-year sentence in prison and had been out leading what corrections officials and psychologists and all of his wonderful friends in the community of Kingston, where I met him, said was the life of a model, like the poster boy for corrections, really, someone who was rehabilitated, who had a second chance, was doing wonderfully, and really was at no risk to reoffend. And so, I mean, some people will say, I think some of my haters, will say, well, obviously, you're just completely naive and stupid and all sorts of things, because the biggest sign was that he'd already committed an offense. And I think, and also it wasn't as though I sort of dove into a relationship with someone who was just let out or had really any, we didn't have any concerns. I felt I was very head over heart, where immediately upon meeting him and going out on a first date, and we met in a wonderful circumstance where he was the coordinator and chef at a soup kitchen, restaurant for low-income patrons, and I took a group of my high school students to volunteer there. So, there's absolutely no way I could have known that he had any sort of anything like the past that he had. And so I was really appreciative when he told me right up front, on like the first 5 minutes of our first date, that this was the truth about him, the unchangeable truth. And, I then just really embarked on a really soul searching journey for myself, but also fact finding, just in terms of I just really needed to be very smart about this and do my research, meeting with professionals in his life. For even if we were going to continue on as friends, it just seemed like that was a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so through that research process and also getting to know him and the people that he had in his life, and none of whom were from the prison system at all, and all of whom were wonderful, engaged community members and so on. We had a wonderful relationship, and Jason was a wonderful partner. We had just a beautiful life together, and we got along like, just like soulmates, I guess is the cliche, but that's certainly how I felt and how he felt. Mm-hmm. And so when he, after living together for 2 years and getting married, when he committed these incredibly violent sexual assaults on 2 strangers in our community and then kidnapped them to our home, the shock was, it's immeasurable. And there was nothing about his past that could prepare me or anyone who knew him to ever think that he was going to reoffend, and particularly that he would sexually reoffend, since he had not been a sexual offender in the past.
Mm-hmm. I think this is an important point that, I think that the common misconception would be that, oh, you fell in love and you didn't know what you were doing, and you were missing signs and guideposts, and it sounds like you really took a very thoughtful approach to this. It's not like you were being I'm not sure what the word. I've been having trouble finding my words this week.
Yeah,
But
I can tell you all the terrible things I've been called. Yeah, and, yeah, and I think that really comes from, like, I remember interviewing in a Montreal radio station, and the interviewer asking me something, and so you were very young when this happened, and I said, well, actually, I was 30, which I think is a reasonable age at which to get married.
Yes, very.
And or sort of looking at me and looking for what would make me different from other people. So that maybe is not well explained, but I would say the people who sort of ran from my life or had accusations or all these negative things to say about me, I think were people who were legitimately terrified. It was such a horrific. It was just very, very traumatizing, first and foremost for the victims, of course, and their friends and family. And then, for anyone who knew Jason, his parole officer, who was a wonderful guy. I think we were his favorite house to visit. He'd pop over once a month or every 6 weeks for coffee. And for him, this was, your worst nightmare, I think, as a parole officer. And he was also very traumatized, and he was also, investigated and so on, and questioned and all sorts of things. For the store owner where the crimes happened, for me, for my family, it was really just the ripple effect of this violence was enormous.
Well, I can imagine the parole officer must, he probably still thinks, what did I miss?
Yeah, I think I don't want to for him, but I think both he and I have just also really, really come to terms with that. Jason is at fault. He did not give any signs that he was, kind of unwinding internally, as we only in retrospect learned as he disclosed and was extremely forthcoming about how he'd been feeling mentally and emotionally. But he hid that. He hid it, as many people hide things. People hide addictions. They hide, all sorts of problems because they think that they can be in control of it themselves. They can manage it because of the shame or the fear of getting caught with whatever it is. It's devastating, to sort of think that they had help. And I just remember, one of the first things that I said to Jason when I went to visit him in jail a few days after he'd been arrested. And, I went to do that because the predominant question was, what happened?
Right.
What happened? I said to him what my mom had actually said to me on the morning that we all found out about the crimes. She said, "Didn't Jason know how much we loved him?" Mm-hmm. And that's what I asked him. I said, "Jason, didn't you know how much I loved you, how much we all loved you?" And it wasn't that any of us was looking for an excuse, but it was just like, how could someone so loved who had come so far in his life be capable of this? And that type of not only self-destruction, but, destruction of other people's lives was really very, very devastating. And more than anything, it was really, really sad.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And
yes.
People, some people would demand of me, like, where is your anger? Why aren't you angry? And I certainly had flashes of anger, but I also say I could not hold on to anger because my heart was absolutely broken.
Mm-hmm. No, I do understand that completely.
Yeah. And the predominant feeling was sadness. And I remember hearing that in the victim's statements, that the predominant feeling was sadness, particularly from the second victim. And she didn't mention anger. And so I think that, that's something, like victims of crime or people affected by crime in the way that I was, there are a lot of expectations that come on that. Mm-hmm. And it can become then very isolating when we don't live up to those expectations. Mm-hmm. We disappoint people with the complexity of our emotions. And so I think for me, the decision to write and speak about my experience was really to just bring about some awareness or understanding to this complexity, and as well as how you can love a person and hate what they've done. Mm-hmm. And that I think being able to do that has been a very gratifying experience for me. And I sure hope that it's helped people over the years to not be so quick to judge other families of offenders or people who are in really stigmatized positions, to remove the stigma on them, because stigma is one of the greatest barriers to achieving good mental health after trauma.
Mm-hmm. Now, and you were shunned for continuing to be supportive of him as a human being. You weren't supporting what he did, but no. You were supportive of him as a human being. And you were really kind of torn apart for that.
Yep, I sure was. And I will also say, like, supporting him as a human being, but also as a very accountable and remorseful human being. Mm-hmm. Jason had called 911 himself on the night of the crimes, asked for the police to come and rescue the women, and he had developed a suicide plan, which he did not get to carry out, and then gave a complete full confession. So that's also, I think for me, that was extremely fortunate, because not everyone even has the offender, like even known or caught or whatever. And then certainly most of the time a lawyer is going to step in and say, you're not going to plead guilty, you're going to plead not guilty, which is actually what happened to Jason. So we had to fire that lawyer and find a lawyer who was going to be able to help facilitate a guilty plea, mm-hmm. and even facilitate the first acceptance of a dangerous offender designation without a separate sentencing hearing for that, which is what Jason did. So I think it's also supporting, I supported his confession, his accountability, his efforts to plead guilty and to give a proper statement and so on. But I think because people didn't know that, I didn't have a voice in the process. They jumped to conclusions. Like, I remember I stopped to get gas after going or coming from the Lindsay jail, which was quite almost an hour drive. And someone that I know, like from work, one of the office staff, was also at the gas pump. And she was like, oh, where are you going? And I said, like, I was just so kind of like, I don't know, just not prepared. And I said, oh, I'm going to Lindsay. And she said, you're not going to visit him, are you? And I just sort of was like, yes. It just felt like such a punching bag. And just, didn't have a shield of armor around me. She said, well, you should know that there are other fish in the sea. And then she got in the car and it was this whole idea of like, sort of stand by your man or something like that, which was just really incredibly frustrating and aggravating for me that was the perception. And, when I looked at my own experience, I mean, I certainly felt victimized by Jason. Victim's such a tricky word. And he had also committed acts of voyeurism on me, which did give me this official victim status, but I just had a lot of discomfort from using that word. But what I can say about feeling victimized and being a victim is that the V is for voiceless, vulnerable, and all sorts of negative things. And that the triumph over that victimization, in my view, and in the work that I do with victims or people overcoming trauma, is to transform the V into vindicated, validated, and vocal.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
But that's what writing does, and speaking out and stuff, and just being able to, have people really consider things from the other side. And I think that's, my number one, the best messages I get from readers or audiences is just, I never thought before about what it would be like to be in your situation. And now I think about it all the time. Like now I see someone arrested on the news, and I think, of course, about the victims, the direct victims, and I also think about that person's family and even sometimes that offender's life.
Right. Oh, I agree. And not that many people, thank goodness, have this experience, this kind of experience. And so I think it's really important that you have been able to share it, so that people can understand. It's often hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes when you haven't had an experience. And I think reading your book is just as good, better than having the experience ourselves.
Oh, yes, I hope. I hope it's always better to read about these things and go through them. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I love that you used this wonderful phrase, that walking in someone else's shoes, because it's a good transition to talk about this new book, Out of Shadows, the memoir of Timea Nagy, who was trafficked to Canada and put into forced sex labor until she escaped, and has gone on to do extraordinary work. Because she has always said to me, you just put yourself in my shoes in a way that nobody else who hasn't had this experience has been able to do, as her writer, as her co-author. And I always say, yes, in your stilettos. And we laugh, because we have to have such a humor about these things. But, I think to like the physical pain that she endured in literally wearing these incredibly painful stiletto high heels, being made to dance and strip in nightclubs for up to 20 hours a day.
Oh my God.
I think I have never remotely been in any level of this situation. I've never stepped inside a strip club, but I sure feel that I have now been in some of the seediest nightclubs in Toronto through the writing process and through interviewing Timea, listening to her, reading some of her own writing. And I think that that's the most amazing thing about storytelling and about books, is that we do get that privilege, even if it's a painful privilege, to get as close as we can to someone else's life and experience and try to put ourselves in their shoes, look through their eyes and their experiences. So it's been an incredible experience to be able to help bring someone else's just incredible story to the page and then out to readers in a week.
So Shannon, can you tell us a little bit give us some background about Timea?
Sure.
How did she end up being sex trafficked?
Yeah, so Timea, I think her name is pronounced, I know her name is pronounced Timea Nagy. I always pronounced it Timea for the longest time. And then I met a whole bunch of her family and friends, and everyone was calling her Timea. And I said, Timea, I've been saying your name wrong this whole time. And she said, oh, I love how you say my name. continuing on saying it as Timea. Most people say Timea. It's a Hungarian name. As she said, in Hungarian, Timea Nagy is like having a name like Lisa Smith. So, but yes, Timea and I were introduced by my editor from Through the Glass. And she had, her sister-in-law was a police officer who had gone to one of Timea's trainings that she does for frontline workers and police officers, border security, and so on, about how to recognize and work with victims of human trafficking. Mm-hmm. And I get this, the sister-in-law, who was a police officer, went right to her sister-in-law editor and said, this woman has an incredible story and she really needs to have a book. So we were match made, I like to say, and we just hit it off on so many levels. And Timea has this really ebullient, resilient spirit. She's, I think, when my husband, I'm remarried and have twin 7-year-olds with my husband, Mike. Yeah. And Mike, the night that we met at a Valentine's Day party, he said, after he asked me what I do, and I sort of filled him in, my book wasn't published yet, but I was writing and doing a lot of speaking, and I just gave him like a 5 or 8 minute version of my story and then waited to see if he was going to walk away or not. Uh-huh. His response to me was, he said, I just never could have imagined that something like that happened to you. You seem so normal. And
whatever
also,
that is.
Yeah. And also, I think just also really happy. I mean, I'm always have been just a very outgoing, kind of a sunshiny person. I really love life. And that's what he saw. And for me, I always think that's like the greatest reward, that you're no longer walking around. Like when you have PTSD, to me, it feels like you are walking around with a loaded gun. And it's very frightening to have it. It's frightening to live in a world that you have to be hyper vigilant of. And so overcoming that trauma, I think we always have our trauma stories, Timea and I often connect around still having triggers. There are still times when we feel vulnerable and can relive parts of our experience. But it's I think this great spirit of life loving and a positive outlook that creates resilience or elasticity to get through those times. So when I met Timea, I think I said the exact same thing to her that Mike had said to me when she sort of, told me the basics of her story, which I'll tell you in a moment. I just sort of said to Timea, I can't believe that that you have gone through this. Whatever I don't know what I thought someone who had been trafficked and put into forced sex labor would look like or act like, but Timea is just someone you love to have around. She's just a beautiful, smart, and fun-loving person, and incredibly hardworking. So she, kind of in a nutshell, Timea grew up in communist Hungary. We are about the same age. She's just about to turn 41, and I'm just a couple of years older than that. We'll call it the same. She grew up in communist Hungary, and she had this budding career as a VJ on TV, promoting music, making music videos, as a little small business by the time she was 17, 18, 19. And then what happened in Hungary, or in all of Eastern Europe, really, after the fall of communism, is that the economies fell. The countries and populations found themselves ill-equipped to make such a sudden transformation to free market economy, while they'd been raised parented by a communist government, not making their own decisions, kind of brainwashed in many ways, and just having all of this ideology, as well as not having computers or cordless phones or all the things that she talked about. And then all of a sudden the wall came down, the Russians left, and it was like a sort of a free-for-all for everyone to try to survive in this new world.
Boy.
Yeah. And it was so interesting for me because, of course, I remember being the same age as Timea. I remember the wall coming down, and of course the West just thought, like, this is the most amazing thing, and how happy and wonderful, and in many ways it was. But Timea also said, there's a real other side to this for them living through it, which is this uncertainty, kind of fear, not knowing what was going to happen next, having the world open up and then realize how far behind they were and how would they ever catch up. So Timea, like many people, fell on very hard times. Her business that she'd started, producing videos and so on, couldn't compete with the big Western music labels coming in and so on. So she found herself in some serious economic trouble, and she had some trouble with her family. Her parents had split. Her mom moved away and left her and her brother to manage all the bills in their apartment. So at one point, Timea was made a new friend in her building, and that friend encouraged her to get out of her financial troubles by answering an ad in the newspaper asking for young women to work in Canada as babysitters and housekeepers, no English necessary. So Timea went for an interview with a recruiter from the agency, and next thing she knows, she's on a plane to come to Canada. Not one word of English. This is one of her vulnerabilities because, of course, they were not taught a single word of English under communism. Mm-hmm. She arrives in Canada, and the agency, or the agents, as she only finds out much, much, much later on, are a ring of human traffickers, also Hungarian, trafficking their own people. Mm-hmm. And she is brought immediately to a nightclub where she is sexually assaulted by the owner and then made to start stripping and dancing. There are many ins and outs and traumas of this story, the ways that she was manipulated to believe that this was all her fault. The agency was trying to help her. They come up with more and more expenses that she has to pay, and her debt always seems to go up instead of down, no matter how hard she works. After 3 months, Timea was able to escape her traffickers in a very dramatic and frightening way. And then over the years, she's ended up working with RCMP to break up the biggest human trafficking ring in Canada. She won the Governor General's Meritorious Service Award for opening Canada's first safe house for sex trafficked workers, starting a charity and now a social enterprise that she employs rescued victims and survivors. She has spoken at the UN already. She won the Prime Minister's Award, and she's going to The Hague to speak at the UN on the financial aspect of organized crime and trafficking. Mm-hmm. And so that police officer said a number of years ago to the editor was, she needs a book. And I'm privilege of becoming her co-author, her writer on this project. Timea is a wonderful storyteller. It was easy to interview her and get lots and lots of details and do the research, but just be able to put my own writing skills to it. Mm-hmm. And language skills, as of course Timea was not able to get a full education and learned English on her own from watching Friends because of background. So yeah, so we have our baby coming out next week, as we like to call it.
Well, what struck me about what you just said is that she opened the first safe house for sex trafficking victims. I mean, yes. That floors me that's the first, that there wasn't anything. I mean, what year was that?
Let me think. That
Ish.
Was I want to say ish. I want to say around 2007. I should really, really know, but it's all in the book, and I've let some of the details go from my mind.
That's understandable. But there's nothing before 2007? That's incredible.
No, and there also is not one now. Timea was sort of forced to close that due to ongoing funding battles. They opened that house in Hamilton, Ontario, she and her organization. They had capacity for, I believe they had 8 beds and would take victims for sort of up to a week until they found a little bit more stable home for them, or were able to get them back to their families, have them in kind of like an anti-brainwashing counseling and so on. And they ended up receiving sometimes up to 200 requests a month from police. And they were unable to keep it open. So again, another hope is that with this book coming out, that people are going to become really, really aware of this incredible issue that it's just a huge issue in Canada right now, that we'll be able to get permanent funding for another safe house. And Timea has also opened this wonderful social enterprise corporation called Timea's Market, where survivors of sex trafficking, and one incredible young woman herself, Michelle, who was trafficked out of her Oakville, Ontario high school, has designed, and they all make handmade beautiful bath products and some other things, fair trade coffee and so on, that they sell, and all of the money goes toward Timea's cause. And it also employs these women rather than keep them sort of at a charity model. They're
important.
So it's just truly, truly amazing.
I just can't understand. I can't believe that the government hasn't funded more of these all over. Yeah, I mean, there should be at least one in each province. I mean, it just seems something. It seems logical to me.
So well, I'm very, very hopeful. One of our launches is in Ottawa, the working group, a parliamentary, a multi-party or non-partisan, however you might say it, just MPs and senators and so on, who are wanting to address this issue. And some very good work has been done. Timea was brought to Canada under the exotic dancers visa program that Canada had at the time.
There's an exotic dancers visa program.
There was,
Oh,
and she
God.
worked with the MP to end it. And I think it was originally designed to sort of legalize and keep above board women who were coming to work in strip clubs and nightclubs, but it failed. And so I think around 1,700 women were brought mainly from Eastern Europe at the time, and were very much taken advantage of in some really terrible ways. Under that visa program. So it has been canceled. But it is horrifying because it also speaks to the demand.
Yeah, I know.
And so I think, Timea and I have talked. She said, I really want to work with you going forward on, for one, kind of some restorative justice and restorative education work, because so many of the pimps and the traffickers who are getting these girls at high schools have, as much as they groom these girls and young women to be trafficked, they have been groomed for a life of crime.
Yes.
There's a whole situation where, there's kind of the rank of boys, as young as 11, 12, 13, being groomed to be drug dealers. And then only a few have the ability to be promoted to human trafficking.
Oh, nice promotion.
Yeah. And I say that, I mean, it's so awful to say, and I don't mean to be in any way cheeky about that, using those kind of terms, but if we don't start to address what is the reality for many young people in this country, that they can be groomed to be trafficked or traffickers, we're going to continue to have a huge problem. So Timea and I are just kind of in early talks about how we might be able to do that, along with her survivor, Michelle. And also, I think just that, I want men to read this book just as much as women. I mean, some of these books and memoirs can be kind of pigeonholed as women's journey memoirs or so on. And it very much is. And women readers will absolutely love this book, and book clubs and so on. But it's really important that men read this book as well. And then we start to understand the link between early pornography use, the humor and acceptance of having strippers for bachelor parties, or these rites of passage for young men, how much damage that actually does to the perception of women and to these young boys and young men's experience of sexual intimacy and so on. And if we just need to kind of address it at all ends. Timea, I went to a training that she did for frontline workers, and where she spoke about kind of her next steps, and she used the parable of the babies in the river. And she said, I was a baby in the river, drowning, floating down this river. I couldn't get myself out for a long time. And then I managed to. And then she said, and then I see all these other babies coming down the river. So I jump in and I try to pull them out and save them. And then I train other people to jump in the river and pull them out and save them with me. And she said, at some point I stand back and I look and I go, who the F is putting these babies in the water? And so I think that's just a really important thing that we need to really address as a society on ways small and big, how we educate our own kids about healthy relationships from a young age, and then how we attack this from a criminal aspect and through financial issues. Timea has developed an incredible program called Follow the Money, which helps bankers and anti-money laundering experts and financial tech software companies to be able to detect transactional patterns in victim accounts, because although much of the work is still cash, much has gone online in terms of banking transactions and so on. And when we can find victim accounts and how they may be characterized, they will always lead eventually to the accounts of the traffickers. And then we can bring them down on financial crime, like Al Capone, because financial crime carries hard evidence, and sexual assault is he said, she said.
Yeah, I saw that in her video. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, and she's been featured in The Economist, and your listeners might want to tune in or just Google search her for The Economist and Forbes magazine for her work on that aspect of things. So.
Well, I'll be putting some links on the podcast website for both of you. What about, so much of this is generational, isn't it? That people abused as children, and then some people will say that ends here, but other people just kind of keep the abuse going, keep passing it on to other human beings, to other children, to animals.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, unresolved trauma has all sorts of effects on people, either continuing on their lives with a victim mindset, or, as we say in restorative justice, hurt people hurt people.
So what is restorative justice? Let's talk about that, because you've mentioned it a couple of times.
Yeah. Restorative justice is, we like to say, a victim-centered approach that is characterized by asking some different questions about crime. Our conventional justice system, our criminal justice system, asks three main questions about crime, three important questions, but they're also limited. The first is, who did it? What law was broken, rather. We see it's in a reflection of charges. Who did it? And it's extremely rare that, going back to my own situation, we have someone like Jason who says, I did it. And then we ask, what punishment does that person deserve? Those systems and those questions usually, and people going through the criminal justice system, tend to end up feeling more victimized and more traumatized than they do feel as though, quote unquote, justice has been served, because it's not really something that's served to anyone. So restorative justice asks some different questions. It will ask, who has been harmed? And in that way, we're opening up to a broader understanding of who has been harmed when a crime has taken place. That will include, of course, the direct victims, as well as their families and friends, the community, the family and friends of the offender, whatever systems are around, and so on. And then once we know who's been harmed, we want to ask, what do they need? We cannot undo what has happened, but there may be things that people need to try to return to having a healthy life while they accommodate a space for whatever has happened to them. And we want to ask those people themselves what they need instead of just deciding for them. And then the third question is, whose responsibility or obligation is it to provide for those needs? And that includes the offender as well. So what is it that they can do? I mean, I know in my own situation with Jason is that he went into solitary confinement immediately after his arrest and was there for 9 months.
Wow.
And in that time, he was basically, society was kept safe from him for all the time that he was in solitary. And certainly now he is serving an indeterminate sentence and is unlikely to ever be released. And he's turned down all of his parole hearings since he doesn't want to be released, as he doesn't know really the cause of his violence or doesn't want to ever hurt anybody again.
Interesting.
But I realized what is also happening is that while society is protected from him, he's protected from having to face up to what he did or make amends. And what that did for me was leave me as the target for blame, for accusation, And fortunately, also, I need to say how much compassion I received from my golden circle of friends and family
Mm-hmm.
who walked with me on this journey and helped me never forget how much life is worth living. And that included strangers that would drop off a little tiny lasagna on my front door, which is just an act of great, great compassion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what also kept me from living my own life sentence to
Mm-hmm.
jail.
Because for many people, you were guilty by association,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That's something I thought happened like 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So yes. And I even lost my job as a public school guidance counselor. I was just told by my school board, you will be returning to your position. We'll find a school outside of town where you can return when your doctor says you're ready to come back, and don't come in the school building. You represent something terrible and it's too difficult for people to see you.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, I always called the second trauma, the second earthquake. And I never even got to say goodbye to my students. And I worked with the most vulnerable kids in the school.
Mm.
With coming out publicly, many years, like when my book came out almost 8 years ago, did bring me back in touch with so many of my students. And that was very, very healing. But I really wanted to do a restorative dialogue with my principal and superintendent.
Mm-hmm.
And restorative justice is voluntary on both sides.
Okay.
That we would come into dialogue, prepared and facilitated dialogue. It's not about crushing people together at all, but they turned it down a couple of times. And that was really disappointing, but still being part of a restorative process with the agency that I worked with was helpful to me. And it also let me know that it was okay to then speak very publicly about what happened so that it would never happen to anybody again.
Mm-hmm. Would you talk a little bit more about the direct dialogue that you do with restorative justice?
It's facilitated, so it really involves a process of preparation for both the victim or victims and the offender or offenders by professional facilitators. We do have a national program through Correctional Services of Canada for federally incarcerated. We have many, 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 many community-based programs in the country. So people can request their interest in having that type of a process. And what the dialogue, when the parties are ready to come into it, is designed to do is, for one, answer questions. I think people who have been victims have so many questions. Mm-hmm. Why? Why did you do it? Why me? What, how am I ever going to know you're not going to do it again? Do you understand the impact that this has had on me? It's very much an empathy building program. And that chance to ask those questions of the person who's the only person who really has the answers is the offender. And most of those kind of questions don't get resolved in a criminal justice process. That dialogue can be very healing for people. It looks many different ways. I would really encourage your readers to just spend a little bit of time exploring some of the online resources, information about what it is and what it isn't. Sometimes people think restorative justice, that sounds like prison pillow fluffing or soft on crime. But what we all know, I think, and certainly any of us who are parents, is that it is much more difficult to face the person that you've harmed than it is to be punished for it. And I know that with my own kids, they would much rather, when they've had a sister squabble, be sent to their rooms or be deprived of something than feel the guilt and the shame and have to apologize and understand how they hurt someone else. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is actually harder. It's also very brave, and I think is the greatest chance for healing. And the results of restorative justice are that instead of sort of the 4 to 8% of people who will say that they feel satisfied, victims who feel satisfied after a criminal justice process, in restorative justice case, there's about a 95% satisfaction rate for those people.
That's a big difference.
And a very low reoffending rate.
Wow. Mm-hmm. And I can imagine that it would really help both people move on.
Yes.
Move forward.
It does.
Wow.
There we are. Yeah. My little people, I have to end on a lighter note because I am hosting, my little twins just turned 7, and this afternoon we're hosting a giant play date in the park our house, and I will be compelled to go and set up the sidewalk chalk and snacks and stuff shortly, which is so nice. One of the most wonderful, we little kids offer this great focus on what's, the little things that are just so meaningful in life. They're
Right.
my healers.
You have your different hats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine that they keep you grounded.
They do. I have to say, though, becoming a mother after such trauma for me is probably the hardest thing I've ever endeavored to do.
Oh, interesting.
I really thought, this is my happy ending. This is going to be so great, and it is now, especially now that they're 7. But it was a very, very, very hard road for me when they were first born. I felt like all of my resources had been used up to recover from what Jason did and come through that experience. Mm-hmm. And then I had 2 tiny babies to look after, a very traumatic birth. And I had to really, really deal with the PTSD stuff again. So my own ending that I wrote for myself took a lot longer to come about. And readers see that in the book. It took a lot longer to come about. And I would say that I'm definitely in it now.
Mm-hmm. How did you deal with the PTSD after the births?
Oh, lots of counseling. I wrote Jason a really mean letter saying that I unforgive you because you did this all to me. To which he responded with more apology and what can he do? And he can't do anything. Really just a lot of support from my friends and family and a lot of tears. But yeah, help is needed for people. It's needed for a lot of new moms for lots of different reasons. So yeah, just do my best. I wouldn't say I was perfect, but okay now.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm so glad to hear it. One thing I wanted to ask you, excuse me, I think that I might have written this down from your book. I'm not sure, but I really like your understanding of victimization. And what you wrote was that another's choices have taken your choices away.
Yes. Yeah. And so recovering from that and helping and supporting victims and survivors has to be a lot about giving them choices back.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
That's my take.
So how can people, if somebody is moved by this, which I can't imagine who wouldn't be, and they want to do something to be of service, to help, what are some of the things that people can do?
Yeah, thank you. I always say start local. So many of our programs, whether it's restorative justice or victim services, or my goodness, my mom runs the only program for women at the Hamilton Detention Center, teaching card making with another one of her retired kindergarten teacher friends as a volunteer, is to look at what the needs are and opportunities in your own community and get involved in some way. Beyond that, there's a good list of resources in the back of my book. Timea has resources on her website, educating yourself a little bit. I think all of those are good things. Money is always needed. Money is always, always needed. So looking to make some sort of donation where you can, whether it's to a local organization or something more broad. And then also getting politically involved and letting your MP know that these issues are important to you, both human trafficking or restorative justice or crime prevention or whatever it may be. And voicing your concerns and your desire for whatever it is that you see as needed.
Mm-hmm. And I want to say that, because I'm American, that I'm sure that we have the same problem in the States. That it's not just you're Canadian and you're talking about Canada, but I think it's all of North America.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the United States, a very recent study just came out that said that 45% of Americans have been affected by the crimes of a loved one. Someone in their family, and 2.2 million people are incarcerated. So
it's crazy.
So it's a huge issue in the U.S., and there are also some really good restorative programs too, I will say. So a wonderful book I also recommend is called Dreams from the Monster Factory, which is the memoir of a criminal lawyer who could no longer keep defending the same guys over and over who would sort of go to jail, as she calls it, the monster factory, learn to become better criminals, be more traumatized and more hard-hearted, come out and into the exact same social situation or socioeconomic situation they'd been in before and reoffend and be sent back. And she said, I just couldn't send any more of them back. So she started to work inside a prison, started a restorative living unit in the San Bruno County Jail, which had a murder a week in the rest of its population. And in the restorative living unit had a push and shove argument once in 15 years. An extremely low rate of recidivism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Sunny Schwartz in the book.
I'll put it. Yeah, I'll put a link for that book too on the website.
Thank you.
One thing I'll just share, and I think I've shared it before, but I still am amazed in all this time. When I was in nursing school at the University of Massachusetts, I was in a small class, and we'd go off to the hospital, and I think it was in Worcester, to do some of our training, and there'd be like 9 or 10 girls to a room, in sleeping bags and all over the place. And one night we were talking about our families and our upbringing. And honest to God, I was the only person who did not have some form of an abusive childhood. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like, I used to think I was the normal one. Now I've realized I'm the abnormal one.
Oh,
sadly.
Yeah. And I think too, I feel at this time, we are as a society becoming much more aware of the need for mental health care, to destigmatize it, to look at how we take care of ourselves, how we take care of others in our community. And I think always it's like an airplane. We have to put the oxygen mask on ourselves first, before we can help other people.
Good
so
metaphor.
It's also very much of doing this work or being involved or being part of a community is to really have the courage and get the support to work through the things, the hurts that we all have in our lives, no matter in what form or to what extremity that they've had, unresolved grief and so on, that, we have, like, I don't think resilience is a character trait, it's a practice. And, I think we just all, I don't mean in any way to sound obnoxious about this, because this is an ongoing thing for me. I mean, it's like, I'm always wanted to, like, very, very often put myself last. And it's just, we do just need to take care of ourselves, because healthy people treat others well. And if we know hurt people, then we know that well people treat others well. Mm-hmm. And so, it's also just about taking the time to acknowledge our own hurts, get the support that we might need to overcome the things that are hard for us, and then be able to give back and help others.
Mm-hmm. I think that is excellently said. Can you say that? Excellently said? Well, I just did.
Sure. I always say I'm a writer, not an editor. I make up
actually, I'm a good editor. It's hard for me. It's interesting. I just thought of this because I've been listening to books more than reading, just because I knit and crochet, so it makes it easy to actually, take in a book, I'll say, while I'm doing that. But when I read, I find typos and grammatical errors all the time, and it drives me nuts because it makes it hard for me to actually read.
Yeah, I know. I must say it's hard. It is actually very hard for me to read in the first sort of 6 months of publishing a book, because I'm kind of still in editing mode. Mm-hmm. Of course I do. I edit my own work all the time, and it's just very hard to just sort of break it. So I'm diving into some House and Home magazines. Just feels just about right.
Good for you. Oh, this has been wonderful, Shannon. Now, before we wrap up, if you could repeat the names of both of the books and how people can get a hold of you, or where they can find your website, all of this information I will put on the podcast website too. But
okay, sure. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. So my memoir is called Through the Glass, and the memoir of Timea Nagy is called Out of the Shadows. Both are published by Penguin Random House. Mine is also published in the US and UK by Simon & Schuster. And Timea's Out of the Shadows is also available in the US as well, which I'm really happy to say. They can all be purchased at the major retailers as well as your favorite bookstore, and of course taken out of public libraries. I can be found at my website, shannonmoroney.com. My last name is Moroney, and Timea is timeanagy.com, TimeaNagy.com, as well as timeascause.com.
Awesome. Okay.
Thank you.
That's great. I hope someday I can meet her. She sounds.
I hope so. Yes, I hope so.
She sounds pretty amazing. Maybe she'd like to come on the podcast and tell more about her story in detail. I would love that.
Oh, and I think we also need to get her to Nelson.
Yes, that would be great.
Community. All the communities in the Coots there. I'm so privileged to visit last fall.
Yeah, well, that's how I got to know about you. Is my stepson was at a talk that you gave at the high school. And he spoke very highly of you, and I just right away I thought, sounds like good podcast material to me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy we've been able to work it out.
Yeah. So is there anything that you would like to leave the listeners with, or do you feel you've...
Oh, I think just gratitude for listening. I think it's just none of us have any extra time. So I always feel like just anyone who's taking the time to listen, I'm incredibly grateful for. So, and thank you, Janine, for having me.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate who you are and what you're doing, and keep up the good work.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take care, Shannon.
You too, Janine.
Thank you for listening, and thank you so much, Shannon Moroney, for sharing your heart and your journey with us. I certainly have a new understanding of what it can be like to be caught up in the criminal justice system. The podcast website is realjanine.com, where you can listen to or download episodes and click on links to my guests' information. There is even a donate button if you feel inspired to support the work. You can sign up for the podcast bi-weekly blog newsletter to keep up on new episodes, archives, life updates, and healthy recipes. And remember, once again, Janine is Janean. To subscribe to Keeping It Real with Janine, go to iTunes or your favorite podcast provider and check out my podcast YouTube channel with video slideshows of all my conversations. Do you know someone who would benefit from my conversation with Shannon Moroney? I know you do. You must. So please, please share the love. Thanks for listening. Take care and be well.